The stagecoach wheels carved lies into the desert dust. Sarah clutched the crumpled letter, her wedding dress yellowing in the merciless sun, while somewhere behind weathered ranch gates, a small voice whispered prayers to an empty sky. The bride had been delivered to the wrong address, but the orphan girl's heart recognized the angel her dying mother had promised. In this God-forsaken land, mistakes became miracles, and broken dreams found their way home through the tears of a child who still believed in tomorrow. The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop, throwing Sarah against the wooden seat with enough force to bruise her ribs. Through the dust-caked window, she glimpsed a ranch that looked nothing like the description in Thomas Whitmore's letters. No white picket fence, no rose garden, no two-story house with green shutters. Instead, a weathered cabin squatted beneath the relentless Arizona sun, its roof patched with mismatched shingles and its porch sagging like a broken promise. The driver's voice cut through her confusion like a rusty blade. "This here's the Whitmore place, ma'am. End of the line." But Sarah's trembling fingers traced the address on her letter, and her heart knew with sickening certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. The silence that followed felt heavier than the desert heat. Sarah's wedding dress, once pristine white silk ordered from a San Francisco catalog, now bore the stains of 3 days' travel through dust storms and broken dreams. She had sold everything she owned to make this journey, believing in the promise of a new life with a prosperous rancher who needed a wife to help raise his children. The letters had painted pictures of abundance, of laughter echoing through spacious rooms, of a man whose gentle words promised safety after years of uncertainty. Now, staring at this desolate homestead, she felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling on her shoulders like a shroud. The driver was already unloading her trunk, his movements sharp with impatience, and Sarah realized she had no choice but to step into whatever fate awaited her beyond that crooked gate. Her boots touched the hard-packed earth with a sound like bones breaking. The ranch stretched endlessly in all directions, a testament to isolation and struggle, where the only witnesses to human suffering were the circling buzzards and the mountains that watched with ancient indifference. A broken windmill creaked in the distance, its blades catching the light like fractured prayers, while tumbleweeds danced across the yard in a mockery of celebration. Sarah's hands shook as she smoothed her skirts, trying to maintain some dignity in the face of this crushing revelation. The stagecoach driver tipped his hat and climbed back onto his perch, leaving her standing alone with her trunk and her shattered expectations, while somewhere in the cabin she could swear she heard the sound of quiet weeping. The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. But instead of Thomas Whitmore, a small figure emerged from the shadows, a girl no more than 8 years old, with tangled brown hair and eyes that held too much knowledge for her tender years. She wore a faded calico dress that had been mended so many times it resembled a patchwork of sorrows, and her bare feet were tough as leather from walking on thorns and broken dreams. The child stood perfectly still, studying Sarah with an intensity that made the bride's breath catch in her throat. There was something otherworldly about the girl's gaze, as if she could see through flesh and bone to the very essence of a person's soul, and Sarah felt exposed and vulnerable under that penetrating stare. "Are you the angel?" the girl whispered, her voice carrying across the yard like a prayer carried on desert wind. The words hit Sarah with unexpected force, and she felt her knees threaten to buckle beneath the weight of such innocent hope. This child, this beautiful, heartbreaking child, was looking at her with the same expression Sarah had once worn while waiting for her own mother to return from a journey that had no end. The girl's question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of promises made by dying lips and the desperate faith of a child who had learned to find miracles in the smallest gestures of kindness. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came, only the sound of her own heart breaking for this little soul who still believed in angels. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah struggled to find her voice, while the orphan girl waited with the patience of someone who had learned that good things, if they came at all, came slowly and often in disguise. In that moment, standing in the dust of a ranch that wasn't supposed to be her destination, Sarah understood that sometimes the wrong road leads to exactly where you're meant to be, and that angels, when they finally arrive, rarely look the way we expect them to. The girl's name was Lucy, and she spoke in whispers, as if the world might shatter if her voice grew too loud. She led Sarah into the cabin with small, careful steps, her bare feet making no sound on the rough wooden floors that bore the scars of years of neglect and sorrow. The interior was sparse and clean, but Sarah could feel the weight of loneliness pressing against the walls like a living thing, hungry and desperate for human warmth. A single photograph sat on the mantelpiece, a woman with Lucy's eyes and a smile that seemed to hold all the love in the world, and Sarah knew without being told that this was the mother who had made promises about angels before her voice was silenced forever. The cabin smelled of sage and sadness, of meals cooked for one and prayers whispered to an empty sky. Lucy moved through the small space with the efficiency of a child forced to grow up too quickly, setting a kettle on the wood stove and arranging 2 chipped cups on the table as if she'd been expecting Sarah all along. Her movements were precise and careful, each gesture weighted with the responsibility of keeping a household running when there should have been adult hands to bear such burdens. Sarah watched in fascination and heartbreak as this little girl performed tasks that belonged to a woman twice her age. Her small face set in lines of concentration that spoke of too many nights spent alone and afraid. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but rather filled with the kind of understanding that passes between souls who have both known the sting of abandonment and the fragile hope that tomorrow might bring something better. "Mama said the angel would have yellow hair like yours," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. She poured hot water into the cups with steady hands, though Sarah noticed the slight tremor that betrayed the child's carefully maintained composure. The tea was weak and bitter, made from herbs gathered in the desert, but Sarah drank it as if it were the finest blend from Boston's most elegant parlors. Lucy's eyes never left her face, searching for signs of the divine intervention her mother had promised during those final, fever-bright days when death stalked the cabin like a patient predator. Sarah felt the weight of those expectations settling on her shoulders, and she wondered how she could possibly live up to the hopes of a child who had already lost everything that mattered. The afternoon light slanted through the single window, casting long shadows across the floor and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Lucy told her story in fragments, her words coming slowly as if each memory cost her something precious to share. Her father had died in a mining accident before she was old enough to remember his face, leaving her mother to struggle alone on a ranch that demanded more than one woman could give. When the fever came, burning through her mother's body like wildfire through dry grass, Lucy had tended her with the devotion of a saint, holding cool cloths to burning skin and listening to delirious promises about angels who would come to take away the loneliness. Sarah's heart clenched as she imagined this small girl keeping vigil beside a deathbed, her child's faith the only thing standing between her and complete despair. "She said I'd know the angel when I saw her," Lucy continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Said she'd come when I needed her most, and she'd have kind eyes and a gentle heart." The child's gaze met Sarah's across the small table. And in that moment, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than logic or reason. She had come to this place by mistake, delivered to the wrong ranch by a careless driver who couldn't read addresses properly. But sitting here in this cabin, filled with grief and hope, she began to understand that some mistakes were actually miracles in disguise. Lucy's mother had been right about the angel. She just hadn't known that angels sometimes arrived wearing wedding dresses meant for other men, carrying their own broken dreams and desperate need for purpose. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, when Lucy finally asked the question that had been hanging between them all afternoon. "Will you stay?" The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a child's entire world, the desperate hope of someone who had learned that people left and rarely returned. Sarah looked into those trusting eyes and felt her own carefully constructed plans crumble like ancient adobe in a desert storm, replaced by something far more powerful than duty or obligation. The recognition that sometimes love arrives not as we expect it, but exactly as we need it, in the form of a lonely child who still believes in the promises whispered by dying mothers under starlit skies. The morning sun carved harsh shadows across the ranch yard as Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Lily feed scraps to the chickens. The child moved with careful precision, as if afraid that sudden movements might shatter the fragile peace that had settled between them. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her coffee cup, the bitter liquid growing cold, while her mind wrestled with emotions she had buried beneath years of practical survival. The orphan girl's words from the night before echoed in her memory like a prayer half remembered, half feared. She had come here expecting to find her place as someone's wife, to fulfill a contract written in loneliness and necessity. Instead, she found herself confronting a different kind of covenant, one written in a child's unwavering faith and a mother's dying promise. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her reverie, and Margaret's heart lurched as she recognized the familiar silhouette of Thomas Whitmore riding toward the house. His broad shoulders sat rigid in the saddle, and even from a distance, she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the reins too tightly. He had been avoiding the house for 3 days, taking his meals in the bunkhouse and finding excuses to work the far pastures until well after dark. Margaret understood his retreat. She had disrupted the careful balance of his world, arrived like an unwelcome storm to complicate the simple arrangement he had envisioned. But watching Lily's face light up at the sight of her guardian's return, Margaret felt something fierce and protective stir within her chest. This child deserved more than a man who saw her as an obligation, more than a woman who had stumbled into their lives by accident. Thomas dismounted near the porch, his movements deliberate and controlled, but Margaret caught the way his eyes sought out Lily's small figure in the yard. There was tenderness there, buried beneath layers of masculine stoicism and the weight of responsibilities he had never asked for. He loved the child, that much was clear, but love and knowing how to express it were different territories entirely. Margaret watched as Lily ran toward him, her thin arms wrapping around his waist with the desperate affection of someone who had learned that love could disappear without warning. Thomas's hand settled awkwardly on the girl's head, his touch gentle but uncertain, as if he feared his calloused fingers might somehow damage something so precious and fragile. "Miss Margaret made biscuits," Lily announced, her voice bright with the kind of hope that could break hearts or heal them. "She said you might like them with honey." The words hung in the air between them, a bridge built from flour and sweetness, an offering that acknowledged the complexity of their situation without demanding immediate resolution. Margaret felt her breath catch as Thomas's gaze finally met hers through the window, his dark eyes holding questions he didn't know how to ask. She had spent the morning kneading dough and tending to domestic tasks that felt both foreign and strangely natural, as if her hands remembered rhythms her heart had forgotten. The simple act of caring for this child, of creating warmth and nourishment in a house that had known too much silence, awakened something in her that had nothing to do with the marriage contract that had brought her here. Thomas stepped onto the porch, his boots heavy against the weathered boards, and Margaret opened the door before he could knock. They stood facing each other in the doorway, two people caught between what they had expected and what they had found, while Lily hovered nearby like a small guardian angel, determined to weave their separate sorrows into something resembling a family. "We need to talk," Thomas said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and uncertainty. Margaret nodded, understanding that this conversation would determine not just her own fate, but the future of a little girl who still believed that angels came when mothers promised they would. The weight of that responsibility settled around her shoulders like a mantle she had never asked to wear, but found herself unwilling to set aside. The kitchen felt smaller with Thomas's presence filling it, his masculine energy at odds with the domestic sanctuary Margaret had begun to create. He accepted the plate of biscuits she offered, his fingers brushing hers briefly in the exchange, and she felt the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder choices. Lily perched on a wooden stool between them, her dark eyes moving from one adult to the other with the intensity of someone who understood that her world hung in the balance of their words. "I never meant for this to happen," Thomas began, his voice careful and measured. "When I wrote to your sister, I thought—" He trailed off, running a hand through his dark hair, and Margaret saw the boy he must have been before life carved lines of responsibility around his eyes and taught him that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. The afternoon stretched long and golden across the ranch, painting everything in shades of amber and regret as Margaret walked the fence line that marked the boundary between Thomas's land and the endless expanse of desert beyond. She had needed space to think, to breathe, to process the conversation that had left all three of them raw and uncertain. Thomas had been honest about his expectations. A practical arrangement, a woman to help with Lily and the house, companionship without the complications of deeper emotion. He had been burned before, he explained, his first wife taken by fever after only 2 years of marriage, leaving him with a grief so profound it had calcified around his heart like scar tissue. Margaret understood that kind of protection, the way pain could teach you to build walls so high that even love couldn't scale them. But understanding and accepting were different territories entirely. And as she watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, Margaret felt the weight of her own broken dreams pressing against her chest. She had come west carrying her own scars, the shame of being left at the altar, the whispers that had followed her through the streets of her hometown, the crushing realization that the man she had loved had chosen another woman's dowry over her heart. The marriage contract with Thomas had seemed like salvation, a chance to start over in a place where her past couldn't follow. Instead, she found herself confronting the same questions that had haunted her for months. Was she worthy of love, or was she destined to remain forever on the periphery of other people's happiness? The sound of small footsteps on the dusty path behind her announced Lily's approach, and Margaret turned to see the child walking toward her with the determined gait of someone who had made an important decision. The girl's face was serious, her dark eyes holding a wisdom that seemed far too old for her 8 years. "Are you leaving?" Lily asked without preamble, her voice steady despite the fear that flickered across her features. The question hit Margaret like a physical blow, and she knelt down to meet the child's gaze, seeing her own reflection in those dark depths. Two females who had learned too young that the people they loved could disappear without warning. "I don't know," Margaret answered honestly, because she had learned that children could sense lies the way animals sensed storms. "Your guardian and we're trying to figure out what's best for everyone." Lily nodded solemnly, as if she had expected this answer, and then surprised Margaret by reaching into the pocket of her worn dress and pulling out a small, tarnished locket. "Mama gave me this before she went to heaven," the child said, pressing the jewelry into Margaret's palm. "She said it would help me recognize the angel when she came." Margaret's throat tightened as she opened the locket to reveal a tiny photograph of a woman who shared Lily's dark eyes and delicate features. A woman who had faced her own mortality with enough grace to leave her daughter a legacy of hope. "Lily," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking slightly, "I'm not an angel. I'm just a woman who made a mistake, who ended up in the wrong place." But even as she spoke the words, she felt their inadequacy, their failure to capture the strange alchemy that had occurred since her arrival at the ranch. She had come here broken and seeking shelter, but in caring for this child, in creating warmth and order in a house that had known too much silence, she had begun to remember who she was beneath the weight of her disappointments. Lily's small hand covered hers, warm and surprisingly strong, and the child's next words carried the kind of truth that could only come from someone who still believed in miracles. "Mama said angels don't always have wings," Lily said softly. "Sometimes they just have hands that know how to make things better." The words hung in the air between them like a benediction, and Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and fear she had carried for so long. Perhaps she had been looking at this all wrong, measuring her worth by the wrong standards, seeking validation from people who had never truly seen her. Here, in this moment, with this child's unwavering faith shining like a beacon in the gathering dusk, Margaret began to understand that sometimes the most profound journeys began not with grand gestures or passionate declarations, but with the simple decision to stay when leaving would be easier. The walk back to the house felt different, charged with possibility and the kind of quiet determination that could move mountains or heal hearts. Lily's hand remained tucked securely in hers, a small anchor that kept Margaret tethered to hope, even as her mind wrestled with the practical realities of their situation. Thomas stood on the porch waiting for them, his silhouette dark against the lamplight spilling from the windows, and Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man preparing for loss. But as they approached, she noticed something else, the way his eyes softened when they landed on Lily, the almost imperceptible relaxation of his stance when he saw that Margaret had returned. He was afraid too, she realized, afraid of caring too much, afraid of building something beautiful only to watch it crumble. The evening meal passed in careful conversation, all three of them dancing around the elephant in the room while maintaining the fragile civility that had become their shield against deeper truths. But Margaret found herself noticing small things, the way Thomas cut Lily's meat into perfect bite-sized pieces, the way the child's eyes followed Margaret's every movement as if memorizing her presence, the way the lamplight caught the silver threads in Thomas's dark hair and made him look younger, more vulnerable. These were the details that mattered, she thought, the tiny gestures that revealed character more clearly than grand speeches or passionate declarations. When Lily finally succumbed to exhaustion and allowed Margaret to tuck her into bed, the child's whispered, "Thank you for staying," felt like both a gift and a responsibility that Margaret wasn't sure she was strong enough to bear. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the ranch like a familiar blanket as Margaret stood in the kitchen, her hands working automatically to prepare coffee and breakfast, while her mind wrestled with the decision that had kept her awake most of the night. Through the window, she could see Thomas moving through the barn, his lantern casting dancing shadows as he tended to the morning chores with the methodical precision of a man who found solace in routine. She had watched him for the past hour, noting the way he paused occasionally to rest his forehead against a horse's neck, seeking comfort from creatures who asked nothing of him but care and consistency. There was something beautiful about his dedication, his quiet strength, the way he carried his responsibilities without complaint, even when they threatened to crush him beneath their weight. The sound of small bare feet on the wooden floor announced Lily's arrival, and Margaret turned to see the child standing in the doorway, her dark hair tousled from sleep and her eyes still heavy with dreams. "Is he sad?" Lily asked, nodding toward the window where Thomas's figure moved through the golden circle of lamplight. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of a child's intuitive understanding, her ability to see past the masks adults wore to protect themselves from further pain. Margaret knelt down to Lily's level, smoothing the girl's hair with gentle fingers while she searched for words that would be both honest and hopeful. "I think he's scared," Margaret said finally, because she had learned that children deserve truth even when it was complicated. Sometimes, when people have been hurt, They forget how to let others get close. Lily nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to someone who had experienced her own share of loss and abandonment. "Like when I first came here," the child said quietly. "I used to hide under the bed when he tried to talk to me. I thought if I stayed small enough, maybe the hurt couldn't find me." The admission broke Margaret's heart and mended it simultaneously, revealing the courage it had taken for this little girl to open herself to love again, to trust that Thomas would stay when everyone else had left. The morning routine unfolded with the careful choreography they had developed over the past few days. Margaret preparing breakfast, while Lily set the table with the serious concentration of someone who understood that small rituals could hold a household together. When Thomas finally entered the kitchen, his hair damp from washing at the pump and his shirt clean but wrinkled, Margaret felt her breath catch at the vulnerability in his dark eyes. He looked like a man who had spent the night wrestling with his own demons, and she recognized the expression because she had worn it herself in the mirror for months after her world had collapsed. They were both wounded creatures, she realized, circling each other warily while trying to determine if healing was possible or if they were destined to remain forever guarded against further pain. "I've been thinking," Thomas said as he accepted the cup of coffee she offered, his fingers wrapping around the ceramic as if seeking warmth from more than just the liquid within. "About what you said yesterday, about this not being what either of us expected." Margaret nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for him to continue, for the words that would either open a door or close it forever. Lily sat between them at the table, her small presence a reminder of what was at stake, of the innocent heart that would be affected by whatever decision they made. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Thomas continued, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to control. "Maybe what we expected wasn't what we needed." The words hung in the air like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes as she recognized the olive branch he was extending. It wasn't a declaration of love. Neither of them was ready for that kind of vulnerability, but it was something more precious, an acknowledgement that they were both broken people who might be able to help each other heal. "I don't know how to be a wife," Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be part of a family. I've been alone for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to let people matter." "No." Thomas reached across the table then, his calloused hand covering hers with surprising gentleness, and she felt the warmth of his touch seep into her bones, like sunlight after a long winter. "I don't know how to be a husband either," he said, his thumb tracing small circles on her knuckles. "And I sure as hell don't know how to be a father to a little girl who deserves better than a broken-down rancher who's forgotten how to smile." Lily's voice cut through the heavy emotion like a bell, clear and certain. "But you do smile. You smiled yesterday when I showed you the eggs I collected. And Miss Margaret smiles when she thinks we're not looking." The child's observation was so matter-of-fact, so innocent in its honesty, that both adults found themselves laughing despite the tears that threatened to spill over. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but it filled the kitchen with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The rest of the morning passed in a different rhythm, charged with possibility and the tentative exploration of what they might build together. Margaret found herself working alongside Thomas to repair a section of fence, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed tools back and forth, each touch a small negotiation in the delicate dance of trust they were learning to perform. Lily flitted between them like a butterfly, her laughter a bright counterpoint to their careful conversation, and Margaret began to see glimpses of the family they could become. Not the perfect, passionate union she had once dreamed of, but something more real, more lasting. As the sun reached its zenith and painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, Margaret made her choice with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally learned the difference between settling and choosing, between accepting less than she deserved and recognizing that sometimes love arrived wearing work clothes and carrying the scars of its own difficult journey.